Please welcome moderator and program committee member Maria Tome as they talk about resilience for vulnerable populations.
So there are a couple of terms in our title that need to be defined. Two terms that need to be defined in our title: resilience, the ability of a system to withstand and rapidly recover from a disruption or damage. When a person is resilient, they are able to bounce back. When system is resilient, it's able to quickly resume providing the service that is needed. Vulnerable populations. They're people facing economic, medical, mobility, or other difficulties. They have fewer resources available to avoid or ride through a disruption. And I might add that at times of a disaster, we are all in that vulnerable category. This panel will look at protecting vulnerable populations from two perspectives. First is affordability under normal operations and to provide economic resilience. Second is under emergency conditions, such as if transmission lines are out due to hurricane damage, or in the case of public safety power shutoffs. Before I introduce the panel, I will share 3 background slides for folks who may not be as familiar with Hawaii's electricity picture. There are 2 concerns with Hawaii's electricity prices. First, Hawaii's high cost. It's the highest in the nation and several times higher than the national average. Second, the volatility of the electricity prices, which are tied to the price of oil. Most of Hawaii's electricity is generated using imported petroleum, using old generators. You've heard of economies of scale. Well, there's also a diseconomy of obsolescence. This slide, the top row, the top bar, shows Oahu's marginal avoided costs. That means the cost of the fuel. The other rows on the chart show the prices of new facilities and fuel, so that's the levelized cost for fossil and nuclear. And below that are the life cycle costs for the new renewables, levelized costs. So if you are looking at your system that has old oil-fired generators and your oil prices are unpredictable, you have a situation such as we are facing here in Hawaii as far as energy costs. This is another way to show the correlation between oil and energy prices, electricity prices. The bottom gray section is the portion of the bill that includes fixed costs and non-fuel costs, and the top part shows the change year to year of the rest of the bill, which is driven by that change in oil prices. Fortunately, as the use of fixed-price renewable energy increases, rates can be stabilized and they can resist the upward pressure on rates caused by oil price increases. This has been illustrated on the island of Kaua'i, which has the highest percentage of renewable energy and the most stable rates. You'll hear more about that from Beth later. So let's get to our very knowledgeable panelists. I will introduce all 3, and then they will each share a few slides before our panel discussion. First, Angelo, consumer advocate. He thinks about this every day. The consumer advocate is an intervener in hundreds of dockets on electricity, gas, water, wastewater, and transportation. Next, Beth Amaro, Member Services and Communications Manager for Kaua'i Island Utility Cooperative. She has been working on this for years, first with the County of Kaua'i, then with KIUC, and in her spare time with the Hawaii Food Bank and Kaua'i United Way. Finally, Ben Ollis, Research and Development Associate, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, who will tell us about a microgrid installed in Puerto Rico and how it worked after a hurricane. Please help me to welcome our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit about, as Maria mentioned, I'm with the Division of Consumer Advocacy. And folks may not be entirely familiar with what we do. We're very intimately involved with the regulatory process. A lot of people are familiar with the Public Utilities Commission, but what we do is we're the advocate. So anyone who has a utility bill, or honestly anyone who pays for goods in Hawaii, particularly because the cost of electricity factors into what the price of those goods are. The cost of shipping between islands factors into what the price of those goods are. We represent, protect, and advance your interest, and that is the interest of all consumers. So that includes residential ratepayers of our utility bills, of regulated utility services, commercial and industrial customers as well. So we're a state government agency. We exist in the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs. We have a team of subject matter experts, several of which are here today, sitting over there. There are attorneys, accountants, analysts, economists, engineers, social scientists, and more. And we're also hiring if anyone's interested. I'm going to throw a plug in there. But we're very lucky. If you get the opportunity to chat with them, please do so. They have a lot of interesting perspectives and can really tell you how we look at things as we go through and evaluate all these, for example, energy projects, rate cases, all the things that impact us as users of publicly regulated utilities. So what we typically do is we participate in proceedings before the Public Utilities Commission. The Public Utilities Commission acts as the deciding body, as the authority who decides whether something can happen. We act as the advocate, and the utility acts as the service provider who's proposing different things for the benefit of their customers. The way we approach our job is that we advocate for safe and reliable utility services, and those are to be provided cost-effectively, equitably, and in accordance with the state's clean energy and climate goals. So I'm going to talk a little bit today, especially my background is in engineering. So one of the things, it's ingrained in us all and all the work that we do, safety is a priority, right? And one of the things as an engineer, I mean, that is ingrained in you from the day that you set foot in a classroom. Safety, safety, safety. It's one of your key responsibilities as an engineer. And I'm going to talk about and one of the things I'm going to talk about is a little bit different than if you're talking to engineers, we love to talk about problems first. I'm going to switch it up a little bit and talk about solutions and then kind of work backwards. But we like to talk about problems because it's important to understand the problem completely so that the solution that's delivered is something that helps and delivers a solution that's needed and addresses the issue. So I'll talk first about public safety power shutoffs, which we've heard talked about a lot today. This is a tool in the tool belt that the utilities are proposing or are currently using to help reduce the risk in fire risk areas. We obviously know that we have, from the tragedy that happened on Maui, we need to take action. And there are things that we need to do. And I would say that, again, what I'm going to talk about is solutions, and keeping in mind that we're talking about here solutions to mitigate risks. And risks come in all forms. Fire, as an example, is an outcome of risks. There are other things that we're subject to, like hurricanes that have high winds and flooding. So the solutions that we propose need to address those threats in a meaningful way and allow us to continue to receive critical utility services in the time of a disaster. So public safety power shutoff intends to reduce fire risk from power delivery infrastructure, and it's typically triggered by a high-risk condition, something where there's a high risk of wildfire. Fire comes from, it needs an energy source, it needs fuel, it needs oxygen, and those conditions are exacerbated by dry and windy conditions, for example. The challenge with implementing something like PSPS is that the critical needs, we all rely on utility services, and we don't often realize how much we rely on those services until we don't have them, even for an hour. There are people who have critical life support equipment, rely on those things. Elderly folks who have cooling needs, even our day-to-day life. I mean, someone like me, I might, at the end of, the middle of a weekend need a cold adult beverage. I'm not moderately inconvenienced, but for an hour. But if it goes on for 8 hours, 10 hours, we're at risk of, say, not being able to provide water utilities, water service because of pumps, electric pumps that are needed. So it's critical that if we're going to implement something like a PSPS, we have certain solutions, or we start to think about how we as a community can either work through them, or are there solutions that we can provide to make sure that people's needs are still met. So there's a number of solutions needed to mitigate just outage impacts in general, because safe and reliable utility service is critical to customers. So we have PSPS, and we also have to get through disasters. And my colleague Ben is going to talk about how we implementation of an actual microgrid as a solution to continue utility service during disasters. We need really resilience-based solutions, and as part of resilience, we need to make sure that we can have the ability to continue that service while the disaster or threat is happening. And I would also offer that at the end of the presentation, I'm going to add a perspective that we also need to prevent. We want to make sure we prevent, to the extent that we can, certain disasters from occurring. So there's key implementation as we think about these resiliency-based solutions. We want to prioritize safety. We want to prioritize reliability. Sometimes, those things are not exactly in balance. How do we think about what's the right type of balance? There's a lot of implementation considerations. They need to be cost effective. They need to be equitable. We don't want vulnerable populations continuing to be overly burdened. We need to think about how to address those. And I know my colleague Beth's going to talk about some of the things that Kaua'i is doing to address those. And we need to be aligned with the state's clean energy and climate goals and address those vulnerable consumers' needs. So one potential solution concept that I'm going to talk about is the concept of a resiliency hub. That's something that could be served by a microgrid, and it can help with disasters, and if properly designed. We can consider undergrounding. You consider hardening of the grid. It could potentially be used as during PSPS for certain load pockets that need to be served. A good thing about that is it's publicly accessible. It's a solution that is available to everyone during adverse conditions. And there's many important considerations that I know Ben is going to talk about in terms of designing, implementing, operating. Like, how do we have visibility control of those, of a microgrid? How do we handle DER? Because DER is an important component of a microgrid because it's clean and it's going to be, with storage, it can make sure it's available. How do we size that? How do we size those solutions to make sure that we have sufficient electricity available to operate our critical services? So I'll just run through real quickly. Here's some resources, because there's a lot that goes into thinking about how to design microgrids and how to think about them in terms of resilience. There's a number of resources, specific gas, and again, I put the caveat in. I know some of our attorneys are sitting in the office that we are not recommending and don't necessarily share the views presented here, but they are useful resources that I would encourage folks to check out. So PG&E, who's talked about earlier, they've proposed distribution microgrids as a way of, and these are the reports, the titles of the reports, if anyone wants to look them up, that using as a mitigating strategy or solution for PSPS. There's a PSPS microgrid site review that SCE did, and we talked about cost effectiveness. Their analysis actually determined that without valuing resilience, it's very hard to justify from their analysis, based on their analysis, it's hard to justify from a cost basis how we start to pay for these things. The other thing I would offer, we also have to think about where we put these microgrids and make sure that we're addressing those vulnerable populations so that everyone can access them. There's EPRI talking about DER's role in community resilience and microgrids, and RMI in terms of building integration and how we can make our buildings smarter and more interactive, and they can interact together to help ride through something like a natural disaster. And then for my last slide, I want to talk about, I mentioned earlier, we think about resilience in terms of riding through critical when we're in a challenging situation. But it's also important to remember that we want to be focused on, to the extent that we can, preventing challenging situations from occurring. And this example I'm showing is a photo from, it's near where I live. It's something I witnessed over this past weekend, actually. There was energized, and it's an important reminder that energized equipment can fail regardless of conditions. Saturday morning, I woke up about 5 in the morning to some noise, went out to investigate. There was smoke filling the area, and looking around, I thought a car was backfiring, running down the road, and I was like, oh, well, there's just the smoke from the outtake of the car. I'm going to go back to bed. But then I saw a flash, and I mean, you know, engineers, what we do for fun in our free time is look at equipment failure videos. It's not to look at the sparks. We're actually trying to say, hey, I bet I can figure out what happened. But to see this event happen firsthand, you do see how dangerous it is to have when electricity is sparking like that. And you see there, like, there's a lot of vegetation growing up the pole. You can see in the circle there, that's where there was conduit with wire running along the side of the utility pole where it burned out. Fortunately, as we all know, our weather these past few weeks, at least on Oahu, has been really humid. So I think that helped tamp down some of the fire risk. But nevertheless, there's still a risk. If this was drier conditions, it could have changed very badly. And the pole did catch on fire for a period of time. So I think the take-home message here is, like, we all want to be, and the other thing to think about too is, like, there's a lot of vegetation on this, so we all want to be vigilant. The neighbors have shrubs growing, which you can't see in the pole below that, which makes it challenging for a utility to come in and address that issue. Or we need to think about, as a community, how we work together to identify these risks and then make sure that we're working together, utilities, communities, to make sure that these risks are mitigated. So maybe that means trimming back the shrubs. Maybe that means working with the various utilities who have utilities on the poles to make sure that we're communicating with them and they're communicating with us to make sure that these issues are addressed. And I would add that the consumer advocate obviously stands ready to help facilitate that communication. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Beth. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Aloha, everybody. So happy to be here to talk a little bit about KIUC and resilience. So first of all, I wanted to circle back to the discussion on economic resilience. For those of you who don't know the KIUC story, we became a cooperative in 2002. Prior to that, we were an investor-owned utility. When we became a cooperative in 2002, KIUC's rates were by far the highest rates in the state of Hawaii. Our rates, just for reference, were roughly, I think, more than 70% higher than Oahu's. So we are governed by a board of directors, a 9-member board of directors, as most cooperatives are. They are elected, they're members of the cooperative, and they're elected by members of the cooperative. We have a number of our directors here for this conference today. One of the things they were laser focused on when KIUC was formed was this issue of rates. So fast forward to today, KIUC's rates, our residential rates now, are the lowest in the state of Hawaii, and they have been the lowest in the state of Hawaii for the past 2 years. So we're very, very proud of that accomplishment. It couldn't have happened without a lot of effort. So just to unpack that and to show you this screen and explain a little bit how we got there, this is the last 3 years of the average cost per kilowatt hour by island. I don't know how easy that is for you to see, but each line represents one of the islands. The purple lavender line on the bottom is Kaua'i, KIUC, and as you can see, over the past 3 years, our rates have remained, you can see where we became the lowest in the state in 2022, and have remained low and relatively stable. So the way that we have been able to achieve that is by accelerating the adoption of renewable generation on our grid. We went from less than 10% renewable in 2010 to as high as 70% renewable in 2021, which was a critical period of time for that to happen as oil prices were going through the roof following COVID. So replacing the volatility of oil pricing with renewables that are purchased on long-term power purchase agreements, which are fixed over a period of 20 to 25 years, has created some very significant rate stability for us, and this benefits all of our members, but in particular for our most vulnerable members, those on fixed incomes who now can better plan on what their costs are going to be, and it's not going to fluctuate much month to month unless they choose to use more energy. So that's been very good for our entire membership. The second thing I wanted to cover was resilience related to emergency preparedness, and we're talking a lot about wildfires today. So some of what I'm going to share with you now relates to wildfire preparedness. Some of it relates to just general preparedness. But in general, we've been working on employing some new technologies in order to be better prepared. And we talk about proactive de-energization or the public safety power shutoff plans. And those obviously are on the radar screen, have to be considered. If the conditions are right, they need to be implemented. But we also need to do that in a very thoughtful way, because there can be consequences, as we've talked about, especially for vulnerable populations. So, when you think about people living in multi-generational households, working parents with kids in school, once you de-energize an area and the schools are closed, they've got to figure a lot of things out. So we want to make sure that we are being very thoughtful about it. So what we want to do is, first of all, prepare our members for the eventuality that could happen, and make sure that they're well prepared ahead of time, and that we're communicating as early as we can that this might happen, that we might de-energize. But then also, again, we want to be prepared so that we can make those good decisions and not have to use it when it's not necessary. So on the screen here, there are a few pictures I have of some of the techniques and technologies we're using. So the one on, I think it's on my far right, the Thor's hammer, that is a new way that we're using to inspect our poles and to get a gauge of pole health. Previously, we would have to bore a hole into the bottom of the pole in order to be able to test the integrity of the pole. Using this Thor's hammer device, we just hit the pole with the hammer. You can see it's in the right hand of the gentleman in the yellow vest. And so they strike the pole, and it somehow sends a signal up and down and is able to determine the health of the pole and whether or not it needs to be replaced, or, at what point it might need to be replaced. So we are using that now. It's working out very well for us. We are planning to use this on all 16,000 of our poles, and hope to have that those diagnostics complete by the end of 2026. So the next is using drones and pole hawk drone inspections that we're doing on circuits around the island. So what we're doing is we contracted with a company that has come over from Oregon to do these inspections. They completed 6 circuits in the Kaua'i area in January. They worked very quickly, very efficiently. They send up a drone which takes very high resolution photos of poles, equipment on the poles, even vegetation around the lines and vegetation on the ground underneath the lines, and can very quickly diagnose issues, the most critical of which are referred immediately to line crews so that they can be addressed immediately. The rest are we make a list and we put them in the queue as appropriate based on their seriousness. So we completed that first phase in January. Right now we have the same group of individuals working on our south and west sides, which were the areas of the island that were primarily involved in red flag warnings last fall. And then the third image I have here is a tempest weather station. We've started deploying these around the island so that we can have better situational awareness of weather conditions and other conditions around our equipment, especially in remote areas. We found in September, following the devastation on Maui in August, in September, there was a red flag warning that was issued. We did de-energize lines leading up into Kaua'i and down on the South Shore. We had very little information really in real time about what the weather conditions were. I remember getting many calls from people in Kaua'i those couple of days from people who were wondering, because there was absolutely no wind, why they didn't have power. So what we're hoping to do with this technology, this tempest weather stations, is to be able to have better real-time information so that while we're monitoring conditions, we know when we hit the point where we should probably de-energize the line. And again, also vegetation management. You know, we are definitely stepping up and spending more money on vegetation management to trim trees and work on what the drones are showing us below our lines, as well as other stakeholders. We're grateful. The Department of Hawaiian Homelands has been doing a lot of vegetation management. The County of Kaua'i, State of Hawaii Department of Transportation. So that's another big way to do that. So again, just trying to be better informed, be better prepared, and hopefully not have to burden our customers, and especially those who are most vulnerable, with unnecessary power shutoffs. And I will turn it over to Ben.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Maria, for the opportunity to be here. Really glad to be able to present some of the work that's been going on at Oak Ridge, specifically for some microgrids in Puerto Rico. So just as a point of reference, Puerto Rico is a little bit smaller than the Big Island of Hawaii, but it has about 2.5 times the population. So there are about 3 million people who live on Puerto Rico. They face a lot of issues with energy reliability, a lot of similar things, echoed comments from the keynote speaker this morning, where there's a lot of aging infrastructure, becoming really old. There's not a lot of maintenance occurring on those lines. A lot of the population centers of Puerto Rico are situated along the coast, and specifically along the northern coast near San Juan, but almost all of the generation is on the south side of the island, which is primarily oil-based, but there are quite a few wind and solar farms in that area as well. The central mountainous region of Puerto Rico is where all the transmission lines run. And as you can imagine, when there's a hurricane or another natural disaster, those are the areas that are most affected. Transmission lines become damaged in those areas, and oftentimes the smaller communities, the folks who are up in the mountains or in remote areas, are the last ones to be restored. I'm going to talk about this project that is in Adjuntas, which you can see with the orange dot on the map there, which is in the central western region of Puerto Rico. This is an area that was hit especially hard following Hurricane Maria in 2017. I've been working on the island of Puerto Rico since 2018, soon after Hurricane Maria, developing microgrids for both industrial and residential scale customers to provide energy resiliency. So Adjuntas was out of power for around 6 months. There are other locations within Puerto Rico that were out for up to 9 months. Following Hurricane Maria because of damaged infrastructure. So following Hurricane Maria, Casa Pueblo, the Honol Foundation, and Rivian came together and were able to come up with this project in Adjuntas to build community microgrids to service this community in the case of another hurricane and a cutoff from the bulk electric grid of Puerto Rico, so that they can have their own generation and be able to operate a small pocket of businesses in the central region of the town for people to gather, to go and be able to charge phones, to have lights, to have warm water, some of the things that we often take for granted on our day-to-day lives. These microgrids also power some critical facilities. They power pharmacies, they power retirement homes, they power a few places like churches where people could go if their home is damaged or destroyed as a result of the hurricane, to go and have a place to sleep and stay. There is a pizzeria, which you wouldn't necessarily consider a critical infrastructure in most cases, but if that's the only place you can go to get a warm meal, you will be very happy to have pizza. So this project is funded out of the Solar Energy Technologies Office of the Department of Energy. And let me be clear, the project started before the Department of Energy got involved through these nonprofits to build these microgrids. The Department of Energy paid a grant to the community and to us to be able to come in and try to make the community more resilient, to deploy more technologies to look at communications and interactions between microgrids to hopefully make them more resilient in the long term. So this is an aerial view of the town square in Adjuntas. There are 2 microgrids deployed there, one on what we call the east block and then one on the north block. So each one is a little less than 100 kilowatts or so of rooftop solar. And then each of the microgrids has its own battery energy storage system that is deployed with it. There is some load diversity in each of these microgrids. I mentioned some of these before, but we've got things like furniture shops, souvenir shops, bakeries, cafes, hardware stores, pharmacies, churches, all these types of loads, some more critical than others, but each has its own set of services that it can provide to a community in the wake of a natural disaster. A hardware store can provide tools and materials for rebuilding following disasters. A cyber cafe, you don't think about it, but it can be a way for people to go and get communications out to tell loved ones that they're okay, to just reach out, talk to the outside world in some manner, because following Hurricane Maria, a lot of the cell phone network was down for extended periods of time, but there were some emergency backup cellular towers that were able to be deployed to be able to get some emergency communications out to emergency services. So following Hurricane Maria, there was a concerted effort from the community to come together, form a cooperative, but also from a local nonprofit called Casa Pueblo to go and build the first version of a community microgrid in this town. They have been in the community for many years. This particular community used to be a mining community, and Casa Pueblo was founded as a nonprofit to advocate for the miners, for better working conditions for them. Those mines have since shut down, and they have changed and morphed into a clean energy advocacy group, not just for Adjuntas, but for all communities in Puerto Rico. To show that they eat their own dog food, as you could say, they have invested in solar energy and batteries for their own facilities. They operate a radio station, they operate a movie theater, they operate a small school as well, and they allow the community to come and utilize those services free of charge. During Hurricane Fiona in 2022, which was a Category 4 hurricane slightly before making landfall in Puerto Rico, which eventually was downgraded into a Category 1, so it was much less destructive from Hurricane Maria, but still resulted in about a 9-day outage for the town of Adjuntas, which compared to 6 months is a huge improvement, but still a long ways to go in terms of resiliency there. But they set up their own microgrid, and here's just some data that they were able to collect following Hurricane Fiona. So these graphs show a few days prior and then the following days after Hurricane Fiona. The top graph shows the grid power that's being consumed by Casa Pueblo. You can see in the few days leading up to the hurricane, there are times when they're consuming power, and there are times when they're exporting power back to the main grid as a net exporter. You can see below that a PV generation graph for their rooftop solar, and then below that is their consumption of loads within Casa Pueblo and the surrounding buildings on their campus. You can see around on 9/18, around 1 in the afternoon or so, grid power goes away as a result of Hurricane Fiona. Solar production is down because you have a lot of cloud cover, a lot of rain, other things. And for a few days, you can see there is some consumption. It's very low, but there is some consumption, so they're running primarily off of backup battery power. You can see between 9:20, between about 9:19 and 9:20, there's a gap in data. That's just a loss of data. But they did eventually run out of battery power and were out for about a day. Following that, once the hurricane had passed through, the cloud cover had moved through, the solar production was ramping back up. They were able to charge up their battery banks and start consuming more. And you can see the consumption increases significantly after the solar comes back, and that's because community members are coming, they're charging cell phones. Some community members came that needed dialysis, utilized the plugs and loads there to be able to do their dialysis. After about 5, 6, 7 days of having PV power back, the grid connection was restored, all of the infrastructure was repaired, and Casa Pueblo was able to go back to grid power. So this is the sort of the concept of operations for one of these remote microgrids. You want to be able to ride through and provide services for as long as you possibly can, because you don't know how long your infrastructure is going to be out. And yes, there may be times where you lose power completely, but the goal is to be able to provide power most of the time. You can design microgrids to be gold-plated to provide you power 100% of the time, but that can be very expensive. So sizing and siting and understanding your use case and understanding what your loads are going to be is critically important to designing and building a microgrid. This is a set of data that we were able to do in our lab, utilizing the data that we were able to gather from a set of hurricanes that occurred in Puerto Rico. This shows how we expect a microgrid to operate under conditions of some natural disaster. I know a lot of the focus of discussion here today has been on wildfire, not on hurricane. But you can think of a very similar set of circumstances where you have smoke and other particulate matter in the atmosphere that is blocking out solar production and limiting your solar production, and maybe public safety power shutoffs that require you to go on to backup power for some duration of time, and you don't know how long that duration is going to be. So if you're able to, in the first half of this graph, you can see a couple of lines that represent solar production, energy storage usage. PCC is basically your interconnection with the grid, stands for point of common coupling. So it's where your grid interface is. And then in the red is the load consumption of that particular microgrid. And this is just an example. So if you have an emergency and you can do some pre-charging, you know some weather event is coming, you have some advance notice, you can pre-charge your batteries. Then when your dark sky event happens, so clouds roll in, smoke starts to fill the air, you get a dip in solar production, but you still have grid power that you can rely on. Then your dark sky islanded event is when you have to disconnect from the main grid. You lose your connection to the bulk grid and you start to operate independently. After some amount of time, you will go back to a blue sky, which would be your more normal operations, but still disconnected from the grid. So you're able to utilize that solar asset. Clouds have moved through, maybe particulate matter is cleared out, winds have blown smoke away. So you can start to operate the microgrid utilizing that solar asset instead of only using maybe a battery. Now, if you have generation in excess of what you need to serve that microgrid, you can actually branch out and start adding in more loads around the area if you need to branch out, serve other communities, serve houses, serve other local businesses, things of that nature. And then once you're absolutely certain that the grid is back and stable, you reconnect back into the main grid and go back to your normal operation. So this would be the ideal way that you would utilize a microgrid, especially in a remote community when there's a lot of uncertainty around when power will be restored. And that is all I had. So I will close here and we'll go to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful panel. We have so many good ideas that have been presented, and I do think that we look forward to your questions. Have you guys played with the app yet? Oh, good. Well, that means you weren't, looking for something else to do. So we get to go and talk about the stuff we had questions for each other. So the first question, let's just get it out of the way. So, Michael, so the pole's on fire. Seriously, so how did that end?
Well, I'm here, so yeah. It ended with the fire extinguished itself on the pole. We were able to contact the fire department, responded quickly. Utility company responded quickly. They proposed they did some maintenance work along the pole, removed some of the vegetation. And I think it's a good opportunity to think about, like, there's still vegetation remaining on the pole. Like, talking about coordinating among different utilities who have infrastructure on the pole, whether there's ways we can cost effectively do maintenance. Like, we have this double pole docket that's being opened, where, for those who don't know, some instances you'll see 2 utility poles. That's where a new pole has come in, and there's an old pole remaining that's been cut and still has like telecom facilities waiting to be transferred over. There's work going on to get, make sure those are expediently handled. Like, maybe that's an opportunity there that we could get some, work with inspection, make sure that there's coordination between various utilities, and also make sure the general public is aware and is letting the utility know if there's a concern.
Okay, well, glad that
Yeah, thank you.
was resolved. Okay, so I think there's been a lot of talk about balancing cost and risk mitigation. How should we think of that? Is it an either or? Can you do both? And let's start with Beth.
Well, I think one point I don't think I made when I was showing those pictures is the importance of staying on top of technology and using technology whenever we can. Because, for example, the drone pole inspections, in order for us to do that kind of work, I don't know if you could even replicate the kind of information we're getting by sending a lineman up in a bucket truck to do that type of inspection. So it's so efficient that, it's not only getting the work done quickly, it's getting it done cost effectively. And so staying on top of technology, and I know that HECO is also looking at these same technologies and probably utilizing them as well. But that's really, really important for us to be on top of it and utilizing the best tools we can so that we can be as efficient as we can. Because in all of our service areas, there are remote areas that are very difficult to get to, dangerous to get to. When we can use this technology, we can also better assure the safety of our workers. They're not going up in remote areas. So I think that's really important, that we're always staying on top of and using the best technology.
Any other comments from our other panelists?
I would second what Beth is saying. Technology is very important as we think about, and the best, going back to what I was saying earlier, we do need ways to ride through the events, right? But making sure that we are focused heavily on preventive type measures, so that if there is a disaster that comes, or if there are threats that are presenting themselves, such as high winds or flooding, that we're prepared ahead of time, so that we're not responding or while it's happening.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and along those lines, the resiliency that's associated with something like a microgrid is not free, right? There's a barrier of cost to buy batteries, to buy solar, to buy things like that, all of the communication equipment, control. But when you pay 40-something cents a kilowatt hour, it starts to make a lot more sense, and especially when it can be days or weeks of outage time. It's really hard to put a price on that type of resilience when you're providing power to remote communities. And if you don't invest in it, and you force people to invest in their own technologies, like personal rooftop solar and batteries, there's only a certain portion of the population that will be able to afford those technologies. And that's going to be the people who have more disposable income. And so now they're self-generating themselves and offsetting some of their electric bill. Well, now some more of the burden of bills and other infrastructure falls on more vulnerable populations who can't invest in those technologies. And now they see their rates go up. And so, there's a cost of investing in it, but there's also a cost for not investing in it that also has to be considered.
One more thing, and it is important too. We want to prioritize resilience. We have resilience already built into our electric grid in various places that have, like the downtown network in Honolulu is more resilient because it has, I think it's an N-2 contingency criteria. So that's an example.
So how do you quantify the value of resilience? How do you measure resilience? I mean, if you're counting outages, I guess that's one possible measure of the grid's ability to keep going. But we're talking a broader thing. We're talking also avoiding a problem that you may not ever happen. And if you put your measures in place and they work, the problem doesn't happen and you don't know. So what is the value? I mean, how do you do that? I mean, how do you make a decision of what to do first even?
Yeah, I mean, that's really challenging, right? There's so many metrics that you could utilize to try and justify resilience. You know, utilities have their own set of metrics that they use for reliability, but those don't necessarily translate one-to-one into resiliency, which is related but somewhat different, right? So to quantify it is really challenging. You know, a lot of utilities will take sort of a utilitarian point of view where, you know, greatest good for the greatest number. And so resiliency gets focused on population centers, but that doesn't, again, help vulnerable populations in remote areas. Again, just to harp on that. But yeah, I mean, it's really challenging to come up with what those metrics are and deciding where gets the investment one area versus another. I wish I had the answer, but I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are so many variables. I mean, you can have the best plan in the world, and then, you know, if an emergency hits and now you, from a utility perspective, you have to rebuild, well, you might need more people to help you rebuild it. You might need more line workers. Where are you going to find them? You know, you got to have, you never know whether you're going to encounter like resource scarcity for something that's critical to following out the plan that you've already made. I think that, you know, I look back at Hurricane Iniki in 1992, and I had just moved to Hawaii. I was here on Kaua'i for Hurricane Iniki. On Kaua'i, we had one power generating plant at that time in Port Allen on the south side of the island. So when we went to restore power, everything had to be done linearly from that one point, right? Not necessarily starting at the population centers because there was no generation capacity. So now, luckily, since then, we've got numerous, you know, generating sources around the island, including a solar and battery storage microgrid at the Pacific Missile Range facility, so that we are much better equipped now to be able to not just take that linear approach, and then you just wait until they get to your community, but actually being able to restore power in multiple areas simultaneously.
Yeah, those are great points, and it is a hard thing from a planning perspective, like looking forward as using decision-making metrics to decide, yes, this, no, this, maybe this. I think one of the things that could help is we're going to have to make decisions about where to prioritize, where we want to have a greater probability that utility services is going to be available during a disaster. And that encompasses a whole host of challenging questions, like making sure that vulnerable populations are included in that their access to service, that the whole public is going to be served, like making sure we understand and the public is aware that where these, say, a resilience hub, for example, would exist. And then on the back end, I think it's important to always look back and make sure that if there are changed places we need to pivot, I mean, ideally, we want to be 20 years from now, we want to be sitting up here and, you know, not having conversations of lessons learned. It's look what we did. We didn't have any issues, or the issues were minor. Look how we rode through this. So.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. So thank you. People are adding questions here. What are the barriers to microgrids beyond cost?
So there are a few things, some of them somewhat related to cost, but not so much. So there are issues with integration. When you have panels maybe from one vendor and an inverter from a different vendor and then a battery from a third vendor, and then you have to integrate with utility systems, and not all of that equipment always wants to play nice with each other. And so it takes a lot of engineering time and setup, and then ongoing maintenance and monitoring and utility oversight, things like that. So there are some ongoing necessities that are required from that. But there's also workforce issues, having people who know how to do that integration work and know how to deploy controllers and do all this integration, because you often have a lot of installers who know their product really well, but they don't know the other guy's product really at all. And so it's really challenging to bring someone who can see the big picture and drive the project toward the resiliency goal that it's designed for. That's another barrier. Another smaller one is just finding space and other things for deploying panels in high population centers and batteries, things like that. Finding places to put these things and places to run conduits and communication equipment and things like that. That can be a challenge.
So I guess the logical follow-on to that one is, how can we help that to actually happen more, especially in the areas that need it the most? I mean, your example, there was nonprofits investing in this.
Yeah, absolutely. And that often, having nonprofits or grants or government subsidies or something like that always helps out, right? That's going to, well, always. Sometimes it does more harm than good. But a lot of the time it does help financially. Utilizing those assets in these companies that spring up that specialize in microgrids. And I know there are these companies that do that show up, and there are, I'm sure, a lot locally that do that work day in and day out. But it is, it is still challenging. And I hope we get to a point where vendors are somewhat a bit more standardized, and it's a little bit easier to do that integration work where, we have very common communications amongst all inverters and common information models and things like that that allow us to more easily integrate, like smart home devices where you go and you plug it in, use an app, you set it up, done. I don't have to go and sit and work on it for a week to get it to work, right? I would love to see microgrids go.
And kudos to you and Oak Ridge National Lab for putting the article in IEEE about the success, the work that you do and how it worked, and also the next steps. And so thanks. Part of that is getting the word out. There's actually a question here for you. What link, if any, is there between advocacy and enforcement or guidance? Could the functional placement of the CA, consumer advocate, benefit from any change? Seems like a leading question of some sort. Maybe the first part.
I think both obviously play an important role. There's enforcement, there's decision making, and there's advocacy. I think in most models, not exclusively, but in many models, at least within U.S. utility regulation, I'll give the academic answer, is they are separate. I think it's important that there is separation between the two. When you look at what a regulatory body is looking at in terms of like making a decision-making process, they're really focused on broad public interest, and an advocacy group is focused on public interest too. But it's important that they're going to, that they also are considering and being the hard, strong advocate for ratepayers, particularly those who don't have the financial resources or the assets to, be an intervener in a proceeding. So having a body that's there representing all consumers, I think, is really important, and that they are separate from the decision making.
Thanks. So on the technical side, there's a question about what technologies are there to reduce the fire risk? And I know you had mentioned undergrounding is one. Are there others? And managing vegetation. That's
Undergrounding was touched on by our keynote speaker earlier, and it is very, very expensive. We did a quick kind of calculation of what it would cost us to underground all of our lines on Kaua'i, and I think that the estimate came out at something like $5 billion. It's very expensive. Her estimate of $3 million a mile was pretty close to ours. Was between $3 and $5 million a mile to underground. So, definitely that's something that should be looked at, and we will look at strategically, but it's probably not a universal solution. It's not affordable for, I think, most grid operators.
And there's some research devices that I'm not sure if have entered into, commercial applications yet that use microwave signals and can be mounted on poles to do fire detection. Now that's more of a response than it is a prevention. But then there's also signature analysis that you can do on the lines themselves. You look at the signals and the small signal analysis to determine if there's been an arc or a spark somewhere along the line, or something along those, or a slow deterioration in an insulator, something like that. But again, those are more. I live more in the research world. Those things don't always make it into the real world and use in utility systems, unfortunately. But there are things you can do, but whether or not they're being utilized, I can't really talk to.
There's a question here. How has the PV on Puerto Rico held up in terms of damage from storms? Didn't they have a lot of broken panels?
Yeah, so during Hurricane Maria, there was significant damage to almost all panels on the south side of the island in the path of the hurricane. Following that, there was a lot of new regulations and other things regarding the installation of panels being required to withstand Category 5 winds. So all new panels are required to be built to a certain standard to withstand another Hurricane Maria. Following Hurricane Fiona, there were significantly fewer panels that were damaged or destroyed. The panels specifically in Adjuntas went through Hurricane Fiona with no damage. Now, that applies a lot to how it is mounted and how it is fit so that the panels don't blow away. Nothing's going to stop a tree branch from going through a panel. But there are ways that you can design the array, say with microinverters or things like that, so that if one panel gets damaged, it doesn't take out the entire array. The rest of the panels can continue to operate. And that's actually how these microgrids and Adjuntas have been designed, so that each panel has its own microinverter. If one panel gets damaged, the rest of the panels are fine. So we tried to design and build the system in as resilient a fashion as possible, so that if and when this happens again, the community is in a much better place to withstand it.
Okay, so we're down to our last comments from folks. I would like to just pick up on that last question. One of my favorite reports was done by Rocky Mountain Institute looking at the photovoltaic survivability after or through hurricanes, and they actually went and did an analysis of failures, and there's a report, Surviving the Storm. Go look it up. It's awesome. So, last word, Michael?
I would say let's get a good understanding of where we want to prioritize making sure services are available for folks on the utility grid, and I'll leave it at that. Yes.
Beth.
And also just, there's a lot of talk about technology, but again, we touched on the need to take care of these vulnerable populations, and so it is going to take a lot of work to make sure that we've identified those individuals in our community who need to know ahead of time, who might have challenges. We can't always fix it for them, but working with our communities to make sure people are prepared and have a plan, doing what we can to help in that regard. So keeping our eye on that ball as well.
Ben.
Yeah, and I would just say that investment in rural and remote and vulnerable communities are critical. They've been largely ignored for many years by many utilities across the country. So it's important that we just keep them in the forefront of our mind. They're not a forgotten population.
Thank you very much. Please help me thank our wonderful panel.